Our next session really is going to drill down on how does this spatial data make a difference, and how do we protect it, and what's it done so far. Our first speaker, Graeme Newton, is head of Deloitte's Australian Crisis Management business, and he led the $14 billion reconstruction after the flood events of 2010 and 2014. Floods, as we all know, in Queensland are now a big part of our picture, and Spatial is obviously going to have a huge impact. How, you might be wondering? Well, to give us some idea, would you please welcome to the stage Graeme Newton.
G'day. So I think quite a few people in the room, I looked around, saw some familiar faces, were around in the 2011 era. So a lot of this stuff will be sort of familiar in the respect that the time and what actually occurred. But I think probably what you'll see is the evolution. And I guess, you know, when we saw, the first Gulf War, we saw this massive leap forward in technology around the military hardware. I think we're seeing the same style of thing happen when you get significant events. And in our case, it happened to be the natural disasters that occurred in 2011. Now, I've got a few slides to get through, and I'm going to fire through them fairly quickly. They will be available in the pack, but really what I'm trying to do is illustrate a couple of things, and probably the key takeaways are understanding where we started from, where we've sort of moved to, I guess where the opportunities are into the future, but also the underlying thing is how are we using this information, and this is not just nice to have stuff, it actually relates to significant amounts of money, reimbursement of significant amounts of money, and aligning that with the governance needs of the day. So I'll get into it. So just to sort of recap, these are the things I'll talk about. Over the last 15 odd years, we've had plenty of cyclones and floods. This was the bit that I was sort of looking after at the time. Now, I'm no longer with the Reconstruction Authority. I finished in October last year, but it has been given, I suppose, an extension, or it's now a permanent body within Queensland. When I started, basically there was no authority, and my role was to get the thing set up in the first place. So just to give you a bit of context, the big issue for us, which relates to the spatial side, was just the geography. The size of the area that was affected was just massive, and trying to get an understanding of that, knowing that you physically couldn't go and inspect every location where there was damage and where money was spent, was probably one of the key challenges up front. So where does it look like? So on the state, massive state, about 850,000 odd square kilometres of damage. These are the disasters that sort of happened during the window that I was sort of involved. And you end up with this, in 2011, we had this massive area of flood down the bottom in the sort of southern, southwestern area. And then you had the cyclone Yasi come over the top for subsequent cyclones in 2013 and so forth. So there's pretty much nowhere in the state that hasn't been affected by floods, cyclones, or some kind of natural disaster, which is a terrible thing on one hand, but is a good thing on the other hand. Good in the respect that what it did is it galvanised the need for some pretty solid advances forward, and I'll come to those. So just to give the geographic proximity, there's one that I use when I present to a US audience, which overlays Texas in this, and you always get this when Texas sort of drops into the middle of Queensland, because it's about a third of the size of Queensland. So just a few images just to refresh your memory. Toowoomba, that's the Bruce Highway up in Cardwell, so that's out southwest. Just to sort of the Mud Army, people recall that. So what you sort of see here is a whole bunch of damage that you've sort of seen before, but usually it's life, limb under threat, property damage, those sorts of things. And the need is to try and gather information and to try and do the rebuild. What we learnt though very early on is you need to not just respond effectively, but you need to be prepared effectively. So the establishment of the Reconstruction Authority sort of came about really because the scale of the damage was so large. That was sort of the premise in the original mind. But I guess what sort of evolved since then is this understanding of the need to have a platform where you are not only prepared for the response, as in the emergency services, but you are prepared with this sort of platform that gives you a governance arrangement, as well as a means in which key bits of information can be driven, as well as the money can be controlled, as well as tracking damage and so forth. And I'll go into that. I won't bother with the detail here, but there's quite a complex arrangement between the state and the Commonwealth on how funds are shared and how funds are paid for natural disasters. Needless to say, it's a large amount of money, and the Commonwealth put a fair slab into it. We set up the authority. It was an act. It went through Parliament in 4 days. It had complete 100% support, and basically provided that platform to allow us to get on. We sucked up the capabilities from a whole bunch of other bits of legislation, which provided that platform for us to just get on with the job. It couldn't have been done from within a government department. It just would not have been capable of done. I was running a government department at the time, and it physically could not have been done under the normal governance arrangements in a government department. This is to sort of illustrate the complexity of it. So it was a national partnership agreement between us and the Commonwealth. There was arrangements internally. We had monthly reports. We had legislative requirements to comply with. We had reports to push through. We had a delegated delivery arrangement. So we didn't physically deliver infrastructure. We used those line agencies to deliver it, but we had to be sure that they were actually delivering the work and making sure the money was being spent in the right location. So then we could audit that and track it down to go and get reimbursement from the Commonwealth. So it was a fairly significant process that we had to put in place. So just going through this, and what I've got here is a sort of a blend between some of the older stuff that we used early on and basically more current stuff. And you can see this is Tropical Cyclone Marcia. So you can see this is a bit of a heat map that shows where the damage is and how things are going, how things were picked up. If I can get it to move. What happened was the evolution. When we first started, the available information, I'll just click through. The available information that we had as far as damage collection goes, it was really quite sort of binary or analogue, if you like. I mean, we would sit in these meetings with the leaders of the departments, and don't get me wrong, I was one of them, and so I was sort of in the midst of it. But we would sit in these meetings. Most of the reporting was done using phone calls, verbally. There was no visual images. There was no graphs. There was very few maps put up. Either maps that were put up were, 1969 cartography maps. They weren't detailed current maps around the damage. And I guess what occurred to me is, we really need to take this whole thing forward. And we had a very strong alignment with the Department of Natural Resources, which assisted us with platforms and basically assisted us with this. So it basically became an alliance between us, the Fire Department, Department of Natural Resources, and playing to our strength, each one of our strengths, and focusing on it. What you've got to understand is the Fire Department, were particularly the rapid damage assessment guys, were mainly interested in life and limb in the immediate aftermath after the disasters. What we were interested in is what was the extent of damage, and so the Department of Communities wanted to know how many people were displaced from houses. We wanted to know which infrastructure had been damaged. We wanted to provide linkages back into communities. We needed a whole bunch of different stuff. So that the way the information was being gathered wasn't detailed enough. We've now moved to this point where we actually have spot point location of damage assessment, both infrastructure and housing pickups. You can go back and track it over time. You can scroll through it, and you've got imagery there where you can actually see photographs which are geotagged, which are linked to it. This is starting to build this massive pool of information, which I'll show you as overlays. But you can see those spot points of damage there. So you're at a point now where you can actually start to do it. This year, we were tooling around with it when I was there, and I'm pleased to say the guys have done a fantastic job. Well done, Stephen, under your... We've got one of the board members from QRA here, Stephen Moddy. So what happened is we started setting up this tool which was around scouring social media to pull this information together. The next thing we've now got is this situation where Twitter and Instagram are starting to provide information feeds, hotspots around where disasters are happening, what the damage looks like, what the source of it is, adding reliability ratings to it. So if it's taken by one of our guys, we know it's 100% reliable. If it's provided by the public, less reliable and verified and so forth. So you're in this position where you're actually able to start picking up information which tells you the source, the location, where it came from, the reliability around it, and starting to mash this information together to start to give you far better understanding of what's going on. You can track things over time. This is always the big issue about saying, well, photographically, what did it look like beforehand, or what does it look like now? What was the change in that period of time? The advantage of the smartphone is everyone's out there whacking away, taking photos, taking hundreds of them. You get some pretty interesting ones with selfies and things like that in it. But this is an interesting one here where the photo gets taken, it's geotagged, and then you can overlay it on Google Maps or Google Earth, where you can see, well, what does it look like when it's not flooding? So there's no doubt that that place was in flood. There's no doubt that the damage actually occurred as a result of that event. So there's some more stuff here. So I guess without dwelling on it too much, it puts you in this position. This is a good example where someone posted on social media about a bridge that was damaged. The bridge hadn't been picked up in the damage assessment side of things, posted it up on, I think this is, what was that, a Facebook posting, and then it got picked up by our guys, and then all of a sudden the feed went around, and then they started deploying resources out there to identify and verify. So you had a road and a bridge that was damaged, which hadn't been picked up as part of the process. So what we're doing is we're effectively starting to go beyond what was initially in 2011, you had half a dozen rapid damage assessment fireys who, whenever there was a near drowning or something like that, they drop their tools and race off to go and save the person. Good, that's the priorities, life and limb, someone stuck in a tree in the flooded waters. But the rapid damage stuff wasn't necessarily that rapid. Or they would do, they call them windscreen pickups, basically driving the car and driving around and going, well, this is kind of what we think the damage is. We've now got to a point where they actually pick up at a point so you know exactly, you can track what the recovery rate is. But now we're at a point where we're starting to get social feeder needs. Then you get stuff coming into the media pickup. We can validate and verify where that is, what was the source, where did it come from, and so forth. So you're starting to get this position where the information is flowing. So when you start taking that information and you start converting it into, because the key with this is you've got significant volumes of information. I think we've lagged up again. Yep. So the idea then is you take that information, start turning it into dashboards, because the whole key around crisis management is volumes of information distilled into a way that you can interpret them, understand them, crunch them, and make effective decisions. It's pointless having billions of photographs if you can't actually use them for a particular purpose. So now the Reconstruction Authority's moved from this phase where there's almost 3 phases in the damage assessment, where you've got the disaster response phase, the rapid damage assessment, and then the recovery. And the recovery stuff focuses on things like road rebuilds and things like that, whereas you imagine that the disaster response is, well, where's it affected and what's damaged? So then we go through the governance side of things. I won't dwell on these, but this is basically the things that we put in place. I mean, at one stage at the peak, we had to deliver $300 million worth of infrastructure a month. So we're in a position where we had to have pretty solid governance. You get out there, you do the site inspections, then you validate with photographs. So you can imagine where we are now with the better photographs, the tools and the sources, and then you can relate them. So from a governance perspective, there's no doubt about it. We did benchmarking. This benchmarking is now going to be used in going forward. So not only are we capturing information that was historical, we're now being able to apply that to plan forward into the future. So Cook Shire, for example, very remote, very difficult. Okay, so this is the damage. The reason that Spine Road isn't picked up is because that's a main road. So the branch roads are the ones that are the local government roads. So this is the 2011 damage, overlaid with 2012 damage, overlaid with 2013 damage, overlaid with 2014 damage. So it starts to give you a feel for where are the key points, what are the bottlenecks, where are things happening, where would you invest additional funding to upgrade particular types of infrastructure that just keeps getting re-damaged. And so this didn't happen prior to 2011. There was no digital format. It was all done in paper, it was all kept in cardboard files, and it was just not used. Then there's resilience projects, again, overlaying, well, what is it, where is it, what's the nature of it? And we've been able to track damage from other post-disasters on those. I noticed Steve Jacoby's in the room as well. Thanks, mate. I can never thank you enough for this episode. These guys did a fantastic job of doing the mapping of the whole of Queensland. So in relation to the Flood Commission of Inquiry, we early anticipated there was going to be a need to map the whole of Queensland to provide a single platform. These guys did a fantastic job, identified basically 27% of Queensland is a floodplain. And you've got a tool now that is available to the public. It can be used by the private sector. And what it does is effectively a hazard map, and it's out there available. The other thing we did was use the powers within the authority to relocate Grantham. So I guess really just to sum up in my sort of short 15 minutes, we started out with this situation where when you have a disaster, you have this spike of activity, and then you have this recovery process. And that gap that's being referred to there essentially is saying the gap between the community's expectations and your ability to deliver. Okay? My aim with the Reconstruction Authority was over several years to move it to a point where you actually have no gap. You mobilise in anticipation of disasters so that by the time the disaster peaks, you've already got resources in the field, you're already gathering information, you're already scanning Twitter, you've already got the information in, and then you're already on the process of recovery. And the idea is the purple graph there compared to the blue graph, you finish faster, it costs you less, and people are far more informed. Thanks very much.